Good morning. My name is Jay Hine. I'm president of Sagamore Institute. It is my high honor to welcome you to this esteemed setting where the public's business is considered. Questions of how this state can grow its prosperity and the well-being of all its citizens. That's the context with which we're bringing some friends from across the pond. Because our dear friends at the Lagarde Institute, a London-based think tank, think hard about these questions. And the conclusions of their very fine report, which you have in front of you, and you'll hear much about this morning, give us some insight into our state's prosperity. There's several insights that they've shared that I think are particularly poignant. One is that free and open and fair markets are needed for our world all our world citizens to thrive. Second is that a strong economy is a very effective poverty-fighting tool. Too often in this chamber and elsewhere, we talk about social policy over here and economic policy over here, but our friends at Legatum give us a very clear line of sight to the mutuality of those two disciplines. And third, Legatum's, this global think tank, knows that while our economy is global, our markets are local. We create jobs and create wealth in communities, one by one all across this country and this world. And so they give us a very clear line of sight into that as well, which is why they selected the state of Indiana to release their United States version of this event series, which I'm so grateful to say is their very first event. Stephen Brian, who you'll hear from in just a little bit, the Director of Research for Legatum, mentioned that 7,000 pages were deposited on the internet last night. And so I teased him that I'm not sure if he's going to be able to compete with WikiLeaks in terms of hits, but he should, and Legatum should, because the findings that you'll hear about today are very instructive. They're enlightening. They're important for us to consider in the context of big ideas. But they're actionable. And so at the end of the presentations that will deliver substance from the report, we're going to speak to policymakers and practitioners about what it means for the state of Indiana. And we'll think together, because each of you are participants in either policy or practice across the state. So in that spirit, I welcome you. And I have the privilege now of introducing my dear friend, Philippa Stroud. Philippa and I have worked together for a couple of decades on these questions. She founded a think tank called the Center for Social Justice in 2004, which happens to be the same year that Sagamore Institute was founded. So we run together for these years, which I'm very grateful. Philippa left that post to enter government. She was a special advisor to the Right Honorable Ian Duncan Smith, who was Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions, sort of a Labor Department HHS, using our vernacular. And in that role, she was also an advisor to 10 Downing Street and the Prime Minister, David Cameron, on many of these questions. Following her government service, day-to-day at DWP, she became Chief Executive Officer of Lagarde Institute, which she'll tell us all about here in a moment. But she didn't leave government altogether because she was named a member of the House of Lords, which is a peerage and a long-tail service in government. So we are deeply honored to have you here, Philippa, and I welcome you to the podium.
Jay, thank you so much for those very generous words. It's an absolute delight for us to be here in Indiana, in Indianapolis, in this beautiful building. And it's a testament to Jay and his service that we get to stand here this morning as well. And as Jay mentioned, we have been friends for a long time. And the lovely thing about our friendship is that it's also been mirrored by our experience of being in government or not in government. And there was a time when Jay was at the White House and we were in opposition in the UK. And I was learning from watching everything they were doing. And then when we went into government and Jay left, he became a wise counsellor to us, so someone I could really test the challenges, the ethical challenges that we were experiencing. So Jay, thank you so much. As Jay mentioned, as well as having the privilege of being a member of the House of Lords, the UK's Parliament's upper chamber, I am also Chief Executive at the Legatum Institute, an international think tank and educational charity. And in both of these roles, I see the very real challenges that the world is facing today. Challenges which now actually transcend domestic politics and national borders, and which are causing us to re-evaluate our political, social, and our economic systems. You will feel it here in Indiana, just as we feel it in London. More than ever, people are crying out for authentic new leadership that genuinely delivers social and economic strength. Businesses, communities, politicians, and individual citizens the world over are searching for effective approaches that create social and economic well-being. So our mission at the Legatum Institute is to provide the leadership and the vision to address these challenges. We seek to shape the values, the ideas, and the policies which will create pathways from poverty to prosperity for individuals, communities, and nations. So our event this morning is a critical part of that mission, and we're delighted to be here in Indiana, in your beautiful State House, to launch our Global Index of Economic Openness and the accompanying US case study. So we believe that there are two fundamental components to real prosperity. First, economic well-being, and second, social well-being. And these two are not interdependent, as Jay mentioned. They're not independent of one another. As economies grow and businesses secure investments, jobs are created, and you have illustrated that in this state fantastically. And as jobs are created and people fulfill their purpose and potential, we generate more resources which we can reinvest into the economy and reinvest into our communities to improve our education and improve social well-being, which propels the economy further forward. So you get this economic well-being, social well-being flywheel. And so the cycle continues. In short, economic and social well-being are interdependent. And for our societies to flourish and our people to prosper, we need them to be working together. But that requires open, competitive economies where individuals, communities, and businesses are truly empowered to realize their full potential. So why this index now? Our extensive work on economic openness is launching at an important time in history. Up until this time, economic openness has been a no-brainer. The benefits of economic competition were widely understood, and the language of openness was very easy to use and was acceptable to use. Today, this isn't always the case. Across the world, countries, particularly in the West, are feeling an instinct to look inwards and protect, rather than look outwards towards openness. From the UK's vote to leave the European Union to the months of protests across France by the Gilets jaunes, we in Europe are facing many of the same challenges that you are facing in the United States. People from across the political spectrum have united around a perception that they are being left behind by a system that is rigged against them. In 2016, we undertook the first major study into the motivations behind our Brexit vote. Similar to here in the US, our analysis revealed a huge swathe of British society who were concerned about their wages, the security of their homes, and pressures on their health and education systems, resulting in a desire to protect and look inwards. But the uncomfortable truth is this: Closing our economies, retreating inward, restricting our economic openness will only make the social challenges greater. We cannot solve our social problems by limiting our economic potential. We must therefore ensure that this generation rediscovers the fundamental building blocks of economic and social well-being, the same blocks that formed the foundations of our great nations and delivered unprecedented economic growth and consistent increases in living standards and prosperity for generations before us. More than ever, we need to be restating the case for entrepreneurialism and free markets, because our analysis of economic openness is clear. We will only enable our people to flourish and our communities to prosper if we uphold open, competitive, and connected economies. So we're thrilled to be launching our Global Index of Economic Openness here today, made possible by the generous support of the Templeton World Charitable Foundation and the culmination of over 2 years' work. We have assessed the openness to commerce of 157 countries around the world, as well as the wider economic environment that enables entrepreneurs to build businesses, businesses to attract investment, and economies to thrive. Our ambition is that this index becomes a valuable tool to make the case for economic growth and development. And today we are also launching our analysis of the openness of 2 leading economies, the United States and, back across the pond, the United Kingdom. Both our nations are at a crossroads. Do we continue our journey of economic openness, a journey that encourages startups, attracts investment, creates jobs, and delivers economic and social well-being? Or do we become insular, put up barriers, and close our economies to the world? What history tells us, and what our Global Index of Economic Openness reinforces, is that when countries close themselves off to the world, even for a relatively short period of time, they and their people fall behind. Our pioneering forebears lived through the Industrial Revolution, opened the world's economies, and transformed lives across the globe. We are now living through the digital revolution, and the onus is on us, every single one of us, to create and encourage a new wave of economic openness and deliver economic and social prosperity for a new generation. We're just going to watch a short film which sums up some of the ideas and building blocks of the Global Index of Economic Openness. Thank you. In the last 30 years, the rise of economic openness has delivered levels of prosperity that have lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty around the globe. As economies have become more open and competitive, we have seen a growth in the sharing of ideas and innovation. These trends have transformed many nations, from the state-based economies of the former Soviet Union to the over-regulated economies of South America and the rising tigers of Asia. These remarkable transformations have been shaped by the 4 key drivers of economic openness. First, creating a secure environment for investment where capital can flow to good ideas. Second, ensuring entrepreneurs can set up businesses easily and compete fairly. Third, providing effective governance that is free from corruption and where people trust in the rule of law. And fourth, building the infrastructure required for businesses to create and move their products free from unnecessary delay and expense. Open economies are more productive economies. Economies that become more open generate more economic growth, create more jobs, and offer more opportunity. By contrast, in closed economies, innovation declines and growth stagnates. We face many challenges ahead. The benefits of economic openness are needed now more than ever. We need 500 million extra jobs worldwide over the next 2 decades. It's in our gift to create the economic conditions to generate the growth, enterprise and opportunity that will lift the next billion people out of poverty. The policy choices we make today will have a lasting impact on global prosperity. The Global Index of Economic Openness, our analysis of 157 countries, is a unique tool to help leaders around the world address these challenges. We are living through a digital revolution, and it is up to us to remember that it is economic openness that builds a strong economy and will deliver the prosperity for a new generation. It is now my privilege to introduce Stephen Bryan. Stephen and I have worked together for probably way too many years, and he's just has an extraordinary mind. But today I want to welcome him here as my head of policy, but also as somebody who's advised governments around the world and is really aware of the tools that government leaders need in order to make sound decisions on a continual basis when under pressure to do otherwise. Welcome, Stephen Bryan.
Thank you, Philippa. Good morning. So, Philippa's explained to you why it's an important time to launch such an index of global economic openness. But why launch a global index in Indianapolis? It's because from our standpoint, Indianapolis is a story of how the American heartland can prosper through openness and reinvention after decades of deindustrialization. Back in the golden years of US manufacturing, say during the late 1970s, nearly 20 million Americans earned a good living by making things. But by the end of the century, approximately 2 million of these manufacturing jobs have been lost, and many more have gone since then. But Indiana has made one of the best recoveries in the last 10 years since the global recession. So how has Indianapolis been successful while other Midwestern states have stagnated? It's about policy choices made since then, and also before then, going back and including the work of the great Dick Lugar when he was mayor of this fine city. Indiana's economy has stayed open. Its transport links are extensive. We noticed that as we came in at the airport, although we're still waiting for a direct flight to London. Looking forward to that. It's also attracted major investment from both local and international sources. And we were hearing last night how among the states, it was a pioneer in engaging with places like China, Japan. And this has made a big difference in terms of forging those global links. It also has a pro-business, enterprising environment that's enabled a renewal that other states have not yet seen. And a really interesting observation that I made when I was looking at this is that the private sector in Indiana contributes a bigger share of gross state product than in any other state. So you really have a thriving, strong private sector here. So we're delighted to showcase Indianapolis as an exemplar of economic openness. But let me explain how we built this index and then how the United States performs. Our goal was to analyze the performance of each country on key characteristics, as Philip has mentioned, openness to trade, investment, ideas, competition, talent. Now, in the media and the public debate, a lot of attention is paid to the big fiscal and macroeconomic policy tools such as tax rates, what the Fed is doing, or dare I even say it, tariffs over the last week or two. But we wanted to place more emphasis on the micro drivers because they're often overlooked, and their potential to drive openness and success is usually underestimated. So to build the index, we worked with more than 40 scholars from around the world with political economy, trade, finance, and entrepreneurship expertise. We spent hundreds of hours with them on the phone, in person, debating, discussing, and really trying to get to the bottom of what are the elements that drive economic success, and more to the point, how do we measure them? So as a result, we constructed the index with 4 pillars, and in those 4 pillars, we've got 22 policy-related elements that are the core of the ideas. And we measure these using 108 discrete indicators across all countries of the world. So it's a pretty comprehensive view of the economy. The first pillar, market access infrastructure, is about how transport and communication facilitate the production and delivery of goods and services and how they flow easily across borders. The second is the investment environment, which is about access to domestic and foreign finance. The third, enterprise conditions, examines whether markets are contestable and free, and how easy is it to start and to run a business. The final pillar, the fourth pillar, is governance, which is about safeguarding the rule of law, government integrity, and government effectiveness. So, with that as the overarching structure, which economies are the most economically open? Our overall ranking of economic openness repeats some well-worn patterns. The two places that top the rankings, Hong Kong and Singapore, are quite unique in being city-based economies. And of course, have had quite exceptional leaders in their formative years when one thinks about Sir John Copperthwaite or Lee Kuan Yew as people who really had a vision for their economies and how they could thrive. Now, among the top 30 ranked countries, 25 are OECD members, North America and Western Europe topping the rankings in a regional sense. The United States ranks 9th, being particularly strong on enterprise conditions, as you would expect, although only second to Singapore in that pillar. At the bottom end, 22 of the bottom 30 countries are from Africa, and another 4 of these are from Middle East. So we see quite a gradient between the Western Europe and American open economies and the African and Middle East ones, typically more closed. But the good news, economic openness is increasing around the world. And so despite everything we hear, it's worth reiterating that it continues to rise, and indeed has reached its highest ever point from a global perspective. In the last 10 years, 7 out of 7 regions around the world have improved their economic openness. Asia has seen the greatest improvement, led, of course, by the opening up of China and India. Economic openness has risen in 130 out of 157 countries. This represents about 90% of the world's population, including countries as diverse as Serbia, Rwanda, Azerbaijan, all increasing their openness. And the really good news, which goes against perhaps even more of the media attention, the gap between the weakest and the strongest performing countries has narrowed. The bottom fifth of countries have opened up at a faster rate than the rest. But what's the relevance of this? Why would we want an open economy? So I'm going to take a liberty and steal a line from James Carville from the 92 election, Bill Clinton's campaign. You know, it's the productivity, stupid. That's what drives economic well-being. And economic openness is strongly linked to productivity. So we looked at this, and we found that countries with greater level of economic openness are more productive. And that's all very well because that could be a consequence of history. But a much tougher test is, do countries that increase their economic openness become more productive? Because if that's true, we've got a strong policy-related argument. And what we found is that over the last 10 years, the countries that have increased their economic openness the most have seen the largest increases in productivity. And indeed, improvements in any of those 4 big themes we were talking about, the market access, investment, enterprise conditions, any improvement in any of those areas helps to drive productivity, with improvements in the investment environment having the greatest effect. And an extraordinary finding is, over this last decade, the 30 most improved countries grew their productive capacity by 50%. Now, let's pause and think about that. That's the equivalent of every adult in those countries producing 50% more in real terms than 10 years ago. That is a phenomenal change. And that's not just 1 or 2 countries. 30 countries around the world have achieved that phenomenal growth. And that's about 2% a year above a benchmark growth rate for these countries. And when you think about countries like the US or the UK, which we've also been profiling today, they die for that sort of 2% per capita growth. But this report and the countries in it show how that can be done. And it's driven by policy choices. So these countries that we're looking at, they improve their economic openness primarily by strengthening their enterprise environment and their investment environment. These are the 2 critical areas. So for example, in India, which has improved 20 places in the enterprise conditions rankings since 2009, has undertaken a number of reforms to remove the burden of regulation, make starting a business easier. It's all part of a wider set of liberalizing reforms continued under Prime Minister Modi, and we'll probably hear about that more from Arvind in a minute. Another example is Argentina, the most improved country in Latin America. Much of its rise has come in recent years via improvements in the investment environment and the quality of its governance, particularly following the election of President Macri in 2015. But which brings me to an important point, which will require little explanation for this audience, and particularly in this august chamber. Economic openness is critically dependent on having good quality governance. A stable and reliable set of rules applied to all is one of the central and underlying components of economic exchange. For example, in the past, failure to implement good, effective competition policy gave rise to the oligarchs of the former Soviet Union, the cronies of Latin America, who dominated entire industries in their markets. But now for the less good news. The quality of governance around the world is stagnating, and this is acting as a brake on the economic openness. Over the last 10 years, 3 out of 7 regions in the world have seen a decline in the quality of their governance. In sub-Saharan Africa, there's been a fall in government integrity and government effectiveness. In Latin America and the Middle East, there's been a deterioration in executive constraints, the rule of law, and political accountability. And if we look around North America and Middle East, we see a big set of issues. So at the most extreme, for example, Yemen, we'll all be aware of having had violence there for several years. That significant conflict has destroyed the economy. But a place like Mauritania has seen an authoritarian government take hold, and that's damaged their economic environment. And across the way in Egypt, while it's shown improvement in other areas, its progress threatens to be undone by weak governance. It's had 2 turbulent revolutions in the last 7 years. This has led to a steep decline in all elements of governance, and that has knock-on consequences for their economy. Now, while for some this may seem like an abstract concept in faraway countries, they're critical. These issues are critical to enabling millions of others to participate in the world's economy and indeed benefit from the environment that has enabled places like Indianapolis to succeed. So to summarize, economic openness is at its highest measured point, but needs to improve further in order to bring others into the fold. And one of the biggest opportunities for policymakers is to attract and embrace innovation, ideas, capital, talent from a wide variety of both domestic and international sources. This means resisting protectionism, actively reinvigorating an agenda that embraces open and pro-competitive economies, both domestically and internationally. I think we must remember that sort of the domestic competition is as important, and making sure that markets are open domestically is as critical as to being open to trade as well. Open economies improve both domestic and international welfare, and the index highlights that we have a wide range of levers that are available to leaders. But above all, it's political will, why this chamber is a great place to be having this launch. It's political will and accountability that can drive economic openness. And our hope is that this index can help all leaders and policymakers identify those pathways to prosperity for all. Thank you. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Arvind Panagariya. He is a professor of economics at Columbia, but I think more importantly, more interesting for today's conversation, as a member of the Modi government, he had a ringside seat for several years on India's dramatic transformation. I look forward to hearing from him what this issue of economic openness means from a more global perspective. Thank you. Arvind.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jay. Thank you, Baroness. I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks to the hosts in Indiana, as well as, I think, for me, also the host from London. It truly is a great honor for me to be invited to speak here. Let me just say, in a way, I ask myself, why am I here? And the way I can put it is that I'm perhaps the cheerleader here for both the Economic Openness Index and for global openness. As Steve already mentioned, I'm a trade economist, so trade economists tend to be generally free traders, and I have no hesitation to say that I am one. My latest book, which came out only last month, is called Free Trade and Prosperity, How Openness Helps Developing Countries Grow Faster and Combat Poverty. So it is very much a defense, a very full-scale defense of free trade, and I like to say it really is the first full-scale defense of free trade in the context of developing countries. So developing countries are at the center of this. And in a way, if we think of building pathways from poverty to prosperity, What we are really talking about here is the developing countries, which is where really the abject poverty resides. We have really learned, quite a lot in the last 70 years about these pathways, and I'm really glad that this index tries to pull it all together. Let me just first say that, the index is an incredibly useful instrument to have for the policymakers. At some point, if you're cynical, you would say that, look, everybody is creating the indices and trying to rank and so forth to get into press and all. But that's not it, really. I think, it really is a very powerful instrument. And as an example, I'd say, during the years I worked with Prime Minister Modi, one of the things we tried to do was to really look at some of the indices. At the time, we had the particular one on which Prime Minister Modi very much focused was the Ease of Doing Business Index of the World Bank. What it does is focuses attention, that what are the various components in which we are doing poorly. And to improve then, what else do we have to do? And in that very spirit, I think this index also has lots of components underlying the index. The aggregate value is one thing, but at the end of the day, for the policymakers, what it is underneath this, what is there on which we can actually, what are the variables that we can in fact influence. So they also serve as both indicators as well as inducement to make the changes. So it is in this sense, I think the indices tend to be very useful, and this is a very comprehensive index. I have gone through it in some detail. It broadly kind of puts out 4 pillars, but then each pillar has its own variables and components on which it builds. And it's a lot of hard work. Those of us who work in the trenches also know that getting on a consistent basis so that you can compare these things across countries is a lot of hard work. So my congratulations to Legatum for doing this. I think we will see that this will become one of the major indices on which a lot of the countries will begin to focus to take their reforms forward. Now, to turn to the substance of what I wanted to say, I'll say 2 things. I'll build what I have to say on 2 themes. One is, and both of which I've written books. So my previous book, written jointly with Jagdish Bhagwati, was titled Why Growth Matters. And this one is really in a subtitle way. It is the Why Openness Matters. And those are the 2 themes really on which I want to build this. First of all, as Jay said very correctly, that we think of economic policy here, social policy here, but actually growth is the central binding theme which pulls them all together. And in India, in 50s and 60s, when we started development process, very quickly the policymakers found out that there could be no social policy without an economic policy, because the country was so poor, practically everybody was poor, and there were so many to whom to redistribute and so few from whom to redistribute that redistribution simply couldn't do it. You had to grow the pie. So that you could, so social policy in a way in a poor country cannot be effective without economic policies that produces growth and therefore revenues for the government. This was something that we learned rather slowly. In a way, growth was India's central policy at the time, but reason actually India's effort at poverty removal or poverty reduction failed initially was precisely because it couldn't produce enough growth. The economic model that it adopted turned out to be the wrong one. And this is where I want to go back a little bit, step back to the post-Second World War era, 50s, 60s, and so forth. So, this is where the developing countries, one after the other, they're, coming out of colonization, and they're beginning to launch their development programs. And the consensus at the time, because in the 50s, even Soviet Union was actually seen as a success. And the general consensus was that, look, we do need free trade for the industrial countries, right? So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade got negotiated, and that the United States, of course, led the way. And post-war reconstruction, really, one of the key instruments on which it was anchored was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the effort by the United States to bring the Europeans to the table to negotiate trade liberalization and so forth. So there's no question at the time that the industrial countries, in order to grow faster and, of course, rebuild and reconstruct their economies, needed open markets. So there's general consensus, but there's also consensus among both economists and policymakers, both among those who were advising the developing countries and those who were taking the decisions in the developing countries, that developing countries actually needed protection. So, if you look at even the economists who later on became free traders, Ian Little from UK, Jagdish Bhagwati from the India and the United States, and Kruger and so forth. So, at the time, the consensus was that protection was needed. Why? Because the developing countries had the comparative advantage in primary product production, and if they are going to export, they are going to export primary products. And those really cannot serve as the engine of growth for good reasons. For that, they were good reasons because, the elasticity, both income elasticity and price elasticity were very low. So, even over time, as incomes would rise in the industrial countries, the demand will shift towards industrial products, away from primary products. And so the terms of trade will shift away from primary products in favor of the industrial products. But also developing countries that actually increased productivity, increased investment into primary products, and tried to expand their primary products because of low price elasticity, prices will drop. And therefore, it was a non-starter. And so therefore, industrialization was the only way to actually develop, and for that you needed protection. I think that was the sort of model that everybody was thinking about. And so everybody accepted that, protection was not a bad thing. And of course, and in view of the Soviet success, it was also accepted that, well, the planning was the right way to go. So much so that, if you went in the 60s to borrow money from the World Bank, it'll first ask you, do you have a plan? So the World Bank will not lend you money unless you had a plan. So that was the sort of reflective of the prevailing dominant thinking. What changed that? What changed that was a group of 4 countries, first led by Hong Kong and Singapore. Both of these are the countries which actually come as shining examples in the Economic Openness Index. They are the number 1 and number 2. These 2 countries, although city-states, but nevertheless, they were completely open. Now, Hong Kong actually has had no history of protection, and Singapore largely open. There was some flirtation a little bit in the early 60s with import substitution, but very short-lived, very sensible, nothing serious. Largely the country, it had been a free port since about 1850. And both of these, of course, take off. But then there are 2 other countries around this time, South Korea and Taiwan, which also abandoned the prevailing conventional wisdom that you need protection to industrialize. They, in fact, take the other road, and they actually begin to specialize in the labor-intensive products, begin opening up, and see that exports are the way to go. And of course, both of those countries, some process starts late 50s, early 60s, it sort of accelerates, but by early 1960s, both of them really take off in a big way. And you see these countries, the 4 tigers, kind of growing at growth rates that had never been observed before, at unprecedented rates of 8 to 10% a year. And so what the United States and many of the European countries had accomplished in 150 years, these countries do it in a matter of 30, 40 years. Today, per capita income in Singapore is about $50,000, in South Korea about $30,000. What these countries actually realized, where the conventional wisdom had failed, was that industrial good was not a monolith. There were many industrial goods. And there were some industrial goods in which you could specialize and you could export. So you did not have to, to be for exports to be the engine of growth. You did not have to rely on primary products. You could actually start exporting manufacturers and become very large exporters. And still, the terms of trade will not go against you. Because when a few countries, which are themselves small, are industrializing, That's not going to have a big impact. And anyway, with rising income, demand is shifting towards industrial products, and therefore you're quite home free. So that, I think, was the big lesson eventually. And then the trade economists and economists in general began to study. You come early 1970s, there is a big project that is done by the OECD, led by Ian Little, another one by the NBER, which is led by Ann Kruger and Jagdish Bhagwati. And those projects really study these in greater detail. And of course, the conventional wisdom among economists begins to shift around completely. It takes 180 degrees. The conventional wisdom really turned around. So those who had actually advised in the past the developing countries to import substitution, many of them changed their minds, became actually big advocates of free trade. And then, of course, you come to 1980s, everything gets challenged, and you begin to have some revisionism. And so we had first a couple of very influential political scientists, Robert Wade and Alice Amsden. Alice Amsden on South Korea and Robert Wade on Taiwan, reinterpreting this whole thing as industrial policy and very clever protectionism leading to this sort of growth. Now, that, of course, is the academic literature. It progresses, and this is where later, ultimately, I have written my book, taking on to all the critics. From the economist side, you got Danny Roderick, you got Ha-Joon Chang, you got Joseph Stiglitz, my own colleague at Columbia, and so forth, also writing from that perspective of revisionism, that it was, the clever industrial targeting and protectionism. I systematically argue about that. That's in the book, of course. But let me turn back, that in the end, why these countries succeeded. One of the big reasons, actually, also, the bigger reason, of course, was that they opened up. But also, underlying that success was the fact that this was also a period during which the United States had been leading the global economy into opening up the world economy. That was very crucial, because as these economies opened up, the open markets of both Europe, the United States, Japan, Canada, they became available to the economies that opened themselves. So it became a bit of double whammy that they opened up to take advantage of the world markets, but the world economy itself also opened up so that they could actually take advantage of that openness. And I think that is the big part of the story. And this is where India and China had goofed up. China, for very different kinds of reasons. But eventually, China actually, after Mao Zedong passed away and Deng Xiaoping came in. And there's an interesting story that Deng Xiaoping visits Hong Kong and Taiwan, and then comes back, on the mainland and says that, look, what are they doing right and what are we doing wrong here? And he opens up. And of course, the rest of the story we all know, how Shenzhen, gets converted from a group of largely fishing villages of only about 300,000 population to today's 13 million people, one of the most urbanized spot on the face of Earth. And you have this very prosperous country today, and China, of course, gets the credit today for having cut the poverty by the largest volume, hundreds of millions of people. India was slower, and I think the bureaucracy was very dominant and it was very orthodox, and it took 2 or 3 events. First of all, India's own failures eventually came to the point that in the end, they couldn't really defend it. But also, the Soviet Union, which had been India's inspiration, completely collapsed in 1990. And then China, which was, one of the problems in arguing with the bureaucrats, some of the earlier authors, Bhagwati, etc., they wrote their books and made the case and so forth, but it all fell flat with the bureaucracy and the leadership in India. And often they would argue that, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, they're city-states, so really they don't matter much. And Korea, Taiwan, they're small economies, so they are irrelevant for India and so forth. But in China, which was more kind of populous than India, and also was a communist country, not just socialist, but a communist country, opened up and it actually began to grow at 10%. In the whole 1980s decade, China grew at 10%. That, of course, killed all the argumentation that the Indian bureaucracy and policymakers could make. 1991, then of course there came along leadership. In my thinking is extremely important because in the end leadership provides the governance. Governance actually in a way is everything. So we also ended up with a string of couple of very good prime ministers in the first half of 1990s and then late 1990s and early 2000s. So huge amount of reforms did happen. And lo and behold, of course, India also in the last 15 years on the back of those reforms has grown about over 7% plus. There was a lot of skepticism that somehow, authoritarian countries can grow rapidly and democracies cannot. But certainly India has provided the necessary counterexample. There has been a whole decade actually when India grew 8% plus. But if you even take a little longer period of about last 15 years, growth has been more than 7%. And that has translated into very large reduction in poverty. And in the Indian case, by the earlier successful cases, growth alone managed to actually eliminate the abject poverty. I mean, if you look at Korea, Taiwan, these countries did not have any social programs actually directed to the poverty removal, any substantive ones. For examples, you could find something, but nothing substantive. In the Indian case, of course, it being a democracy, the moment you begin to generate some revenues, the pressure to do social spending is much higher. And so India got a double whammy, So on the one hand, with growth, incomes rose, the wages rose of the population, which empowered people directly, and they could seek education, they could seek better health facilities. But also the revenues of the government increased, and the government actually began to multiply a lot of the social programs. And so India also, in that way, was very successful in cutting poverty, at least the abject poverty, easily by 2 to 250 million people. So I think, at the end, you can be a skeptic always, in the economics profession. We are full of skeptics who would say that, is it good policy or good luck? I firmly believe that good policies matter. And I'm very pleased to hear all the policymakers here as well in Indiana that they all believe in good policies and they attribute Indiana's success to their good policies. And I think we have to keep up that momentum. So thanks very much for shaking up the countries once again with your index. And thank you again for inviting me. Thank you.
You too? Yeah. Arvind, that was a tour de force of historical context, contemporary politics, weaving together a policy narrative with a market-driven economic growth set of trend lines that we need to chew on for a little while. So I'm so glad you've given us this report and you've made available so many electronic files that we can dig deeper because this conversation is just beginning, and you've upgraded it. That was really a remarkable work. Thank you so much. And your books have been very instructive to both policymakers and the public that need to make sense of this. So thank you, sir. Well done. Raju, wave your hand, is a friend of ours who was instrumental in Infosys making a decision to make Indianapolis, one of its largest enterprises. This is a campus now in formation that is a result of terrific advocacy by our friend here, but a new set of relationships between Indiana and India. So we're very grateful, and I'm sure you're going to want to learn more about that. But I'd like to invite Larry Ingram and Gina Sheets up front. I would like you two to stay, if that's okay, Philippa and Stephen, because I would like to both ask you very challenging questions and allow you to do the same of two policymaker/practitioners. So if you, Larry and Gina, could join us up front. I will introduce them. as they make their way up. We are, as advertised, joined by experts in the room. And so we have handheld mics that will make their way around to each of you, because we want this to be a dynamic experience shortly. We're going to ask these ground level experts to fuel the conversation a little bit more. And then we want to interact with you about some of the geographic focus you've heard about, certainly some of the policy activity that is emerging in our state, in this deliberative body, and in our markets. But let me first introduce Gina Sheets, who has served both at the state and the federal level in agriculture policy. She was Indiana's State Agriculture Department Director. And then she stood up the Office of Rural Innovation for the United States Department of Agriculture. So it was her task to think about how to revitalize rural economies in a global economic context as our farmers are doing business all around the world and amidst great challenges in our rural economies, which represent very similarly those of emerging markets, actually. And so she has great insight. She was also a practitioner in this context in that she stood up a very successful farm in Liberia. So she's operated as an entrepreneur in an emerging market. So we're grateful for you, Gina. And Larry Ingram was in Tokyo, as I understand the story, when he got this envelope from an undisclosed American state seeking a director for an East Asian office. That state ended up being the state of Indiana, which was one of the pioneering states to open up trade with China and Japan and a wider East Asia market. And Larry was on the ground doing deals and helping each end of that deal understand each other's markets better. And again, borrowing the relationship term, he knew that it was Indiana mayors meeting East Asian business leaders that would result in some very impressive statistics that we have to report on today. But it happens incrementally, this type of change, and it isn't all up and to the right. And so we want to really embrace that complexity in the conversation, because each of you have heard a lot now from very fine scholarship about the global economic context. You've lived it. So before I ask you questions directly, I'd like to ask if you have any initial observations about what you heard presented in the context of your lived experience.
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much. Thank you, Jay, for the opportunity just to hear about the importance of how globalism and economic development certainly have to be weighed by the development on that social level. And very specifically, the 4 pillars that were mentioned, market access, investment, the enterprise, and then governance. How often do we see, especially coming from developing countries, the poorest country in the world as far as internally economic markets is Liberia, based on the most recent report coming out in November by Forbes magazine and the World Bank. And clearly you can relate that back, and I'll be interested in the 7,000 pages, Stephen, because I can see the direct hand of lack of government policy. It doesn't matter how great ideas are coming back into a country. It really, quite honestly, doesn't even matter the amount of aid. And I'm thinking on this stage and on these types of conversations, if we can move the driver of economic opportunity to the prosperity on that social level coming as a package, remove the conversation of aid that would get dumped into a country, because oftentimes what happens when you don't have that government policy as one of those pillars, which so easy when we're trying to work with a country, developing country, that's a hard conversation, a little bit uncomfortable to get our arms around, and it takes boots on the ground versus what we like to say, shoes in the cruiser. And so we often move forward without that strong pillar until it's too late, until, as you talked about, until now countries that could be in the game are very far behind and have to take an internal overhaul and shift of the conversation. So we've seen that firsthand, and we continue to see that, and very grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. So as we, as leaders in policy and in governance, especially in economic drivers, we can continue to reshape our conversations with other people that also need to hear it.
Thank you very much. General observation, Larry? Can we go straight into doing business in Japan?
May I make one comment for our friends from the Legatum Institute? It's appropriate, Jay, that today we are here in this room for the Indiana House of Representatives. We didn't have a chance last night to discuss this, but one of the very interesting things about Indiana is as you walk around this room and look at the pictures on each place of our representatives, those are not the pictures of permanent politicians. We have in Indiana what we call a citizen legislature. Our representatives and our state senators are part-time, and they meet from January usually through April or through May, depending on the year. If it's an even year or odd year, we have a short session or long session. So they meet for several months. There's only enough time to really concentrate on the most important things and to try and pass them. And then at the end of the legislature, everyone returns to their profession. And the people you see here on the desks are farmers, teachers, doctors, nurses, cattlemen, hogmen, you name it, the people from all over the state of Indiana. And when they go back to their profession, they are impacted by the laws that they just passed. I think this is a really good system. We need this in Washington, D.C., frankly. But anyway, that's one of the very unique features of Indiana, and I think that's what's helped us have such a strong, conservative, pro-business atmosphere here.
Are you declaring your candidacy?
No.
So, yes. And I didn't make the ground rules clear. I hope that you'll ask good questions too. We will ask questions of you, but please feel free to drill down on some of these themes. But while you do have the floor, Larry, I would like for you to frame up the origin story of what it meant for an American state to open a new market as a new market was opening. We just heard this remarkable historic context of China wanting to do business with the world and Japan's role in that. And Bob Orr, who Larry served, was one of the very first American policymakers to enter that market. If you could tell us a little bit about the origin story, and then we'd love to hear what happened.
Thank you. Indiana has really been blessed to have strong leaders as governors for all of these many years, really beginning with Governor Robert D. Orr. And he had served 2 terms as lieutenant governor under former Governor Otis Bowen. And when Bob Orr was lieutenant governor, he came here to the legislature and asked for funding. He wanted to start 2 overseas offices for Indiana because he felt that Indiana needed an international presence, both to promote Hoosier exports around the world, but also to attract new investment to come to Indiana. And he was successful in getting the funding that he wanted, and they opened a European office based in Amsterdam initially, and they opened an office in Tokyo, Japan, to cover East Asia. And the Japan office opened around 1979 or so, and we have maintained that office ever since. It's been a critical factor in the success of our state in attracting Japanese companies to locate here. When I joined Indiana's Tokyo office in March of 1983, we had some 18 Japanese companies operating here. Half of them were manufacturers. The other half were sales and distribution offices. but they had been here really since the 60s or 70s. In June of 1983, however, Sony Corporation announced that after doing a search of all 48 lower states, they were selecting Indiana and Terre Haute to be the site of their first ever CD factory here in the United States. And that was extremely big news in Japan and extremely big news here in the US for us, and really helped me market Indiana thereafter because we were on the map. And Sony really had validated that Indiana's a good place. Today, fast forwarding to our current situation, we have some 320 Japanese companies that call Indiana home. Predominantly, these are auto-related companies. There are some exceptions, but Indiana on a per capita basis is the #1 state in the US for Japanese investment. Those 320 companies collectively employ about 67,000 Hoosiers, and the dollar investment is 11 billion and counting. So we've been extremely blessed to have this support and add to our state's economy. And the best advertisement Indiana has had over these years really has been the success of these companies that have come, and now many of them are over 30 years old and are operating here. We're the only state that has 3 separate Japanese car manufacturers. We have Subaru in Lafayette, Honda in Greensburg, and Toyota in Princeton. So we've been very blessed. Bob Orr also helped us become sister state with the Chinese province of Zhejiang. And back in the 80s, there was no way of foretelling what that province would become in the future. And all provinces at that time kind of looked the same, and it was really a fateful decision that Bob Orr chose Zhejiang, which is now one of the leading, richest, most industrialized provinces in China. So we have been blessed in that respect as well. And the Sagamore Institute several years ago put together what we called a mayoral roundtable on China that we held at Purdue University. And we had 22 Indiana mayors who came together that day to meet the Chinese Consul General from Chicago. It was the most successful event. And in addition to our strong state leadership from the governors, a critical factor has been the role of mayors who understand economic development and lead their city's efforts to bring in new investment. The role of an economic developer, first and foremost of all, is to retain companies in their cities, to help those to grow and prosper, and then to try and add new ones. So in my experience, the communities in Indiana that have been the most successful, Jay, have had very strong mayoral leadership.
Terrific remarks, Larry. Thank you so much. Gina, you were an economic developer in Frankfort, Indiana, one of our rural communities, and then you became Director of Economic Development for the Agriculture Department before you became its director. We had early and profound success in Japan. It was a slower success story for us in China, despite very persistent efforts. The Zhejiang province sister state relationship is dynamic. Hangzhou, its capital is, of course, where Nixon met Mao to open up U.S.-China relations, so it's been a high privilege for us to be engaged there. But doing deals didn't happen as fast. You were over there selling our popcorn and doing some other activity. Can you reflect on those days as a staff member to the Lieutenant Governor who had that mission?
Absolutely, and I think one of the underlying tones that you can hear when Larry was talking about the relationship building, and that's what it's about. And certainly that's what we continue to do with China, is to develop those relationships. One of the relationships that came together, the educational, the school, sister school relationships on doing exchanges between Indiana school systems and China school systems to see how teaching is different, to see how student interaction is different, how student learning looks different. So that is relationship-based. The other, of course, agriculture and relationship development. Agriculture, sometimes we forget when we see corn or soybeans in our field. It seems so simple that we could put them on a barge and take them to any country in the world, but there's licensing and there's technology and there's conversation that goes along with that, and adaptation to understand what those needs are. And so we spent a lot of time just working on that community level, not so much of just what can you sell into a country, but that openness. What do you have to bring in that we can work on a two-way street? What is it that we can trade together? We spent probably 2 years working on a beef relationship with China, back and forth. We had a little window of opportunity that was open, and then it was quickly shut. But you continued, even though with doors closed, you continued to have conversations and relationships, hoping that government policy would open that door to allow that trade to continue and to certainly grow. And so we spent a lot of time working on that, and also the think tank relationship that the Sagamore was building.
Thank you very much. Philippa?
Yes, I just wanted to ask Gina a question, actually, in particularly in relation to your connections with Africa, and thinking about whether or not, what will happen with that extraordinary continent were they to have the same economic openness, or the ability to have the same economic openness that, say, our nations have, and whether or not you think that the creation of the African Union will be a step forward in allowing them to create value-added products in the way that we are so free to. I'd love to hear your thinking on that.
So first of all, the opportunity for openness and what we have experienced in the different countries that we've worked with or worked in, everything to grow and to develop exists. That platform, that foundation exists. And the conversation of colonialism, and so we've heard that from some countries where they have been colonized and they have gotten their own democracy built, but somewhere along the lines, they have forgotten about that policy and governance and setting that up. The African Union brings the conversation most importantly on the continent of Africa. A lot of expertise is needed, certainly, and development and guidance is needed, but the end result is that countries have to figure out how to work within their own framework. They have to build that policy of trust, relationship, and to remove those barriers internal barriers, I think, are extremely important. Where that takes the expertise of realizing what's going on from an outside viewfinder looking in, but more importantly, from an inside, how do you work that out? And I think the African Union can do that so much easier, especially when we realize that the opportunity for development fully exists. The opportunity to develop markets, agriculture markets, and food markets fully exist. It's that barrier of developing a social economy.
Very good. Well, we have a terrific room I've advertised. I'd love to engage them in the conversation. I don't know if we have handheld mics for the audience. You could channel your inner House of Representatives member and maybe speak into the House microphone, but why don't we use these? If you could please ask a question by first sharing your name and organization. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry I wasn't here for breakfast earlier. My name's Carrie Hamilton. I'm a state representative, and I have not been in this chamber since we finished back on Sine Die 3-4 weeks ago. I'm glad to be here for this event. I'm learning a lot already. I love the historical context, the story about Lieutenant Governor Orr and his work to build offices across the globe. My question, I think, also I have to share that Ms. Sheets, my husband, is a proud Frankfurter, hot dog, a proud son of your community. My question is about the role of open democracies. I know that one of the pillars of this report that I haven't looked at yet is about good government, strong democracies in this role. And in our current climate, what is if there is a leadership that democracies need to take that are open as they're working with other countries that may be less so? I think this week of Viktor Orban being welcomed publicly, that gave me some concern. I know that when Governor Holcomb most recently went to Hungary to visit with our trading partners there, there was less of a public acknowledgement of the government for this most recent trip. And I was glad to learn that. So your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Maybe Stephen?
Sure, thank you. I think what we have found is that there's a very strong link between the contestability of markets, which we want to have, insofar as we want to make sure that you do not have government and business cozying up to each other. So that market contestability is very closely related to the level of sort of political plurality and political contestability. So if you have a democratic system where a variety of views are in the public square, but that they are being debated and treated with respect and a genuine sense of, look, there are many different ways of looking at things. We can have a democratic debate. We can come to a resolution. That sort of mindset and psychology is also very related to, there are many different ways of building businesses. There are many different ways of competing in markets. And what we have certainly found is that the markets that are most open, the markets that are most contestable, tend to be ones where the political arena has a similar characteristic of contestability. And when that gets shut down, whether it is shutting down discordant voices, acting in a bullying way, the same attitude and behavior tend to spill over into the economic domain. And you have the same sort of thing that big business that cozies up, favored relationships become the norm, and the insiders start to take control, and the outsiders are squeezed out. And it's really part of what we're arguing here, and that's why I made the comment at the very end of my remarks about domestic contestability, domestic competition is as important. That if we want prosperous nations where all can engage economically and where those on the outside have a chance to compete, we have to make sure that that root of openness is there in both the economic and the political sphere, so that people are not shut out, people are not powerless. And I think when you look around the world, you see that the decline in prosperity, when you see it, tends to happen when a strong, quote, strong politician starts to take too much charge, starts to shut down debate, and doesn't allow this sort of continuous experimentation of both political ideas and business ideas.
Thank you, and thank you for having us in the house.
Thank you.
Philippa and Stephen, I have a question for you. We've appropriately spent a lot of time on governance and policy to enable market growth. We've not talked a lot about competition yet, and yet markets thrive when its actors compete and make each other better. Indiana competes with other states. We want America to win. We want to grow the American economy. One of the ways we help that to happen is by competing with our neighbor states. We understand our regional context, but we're also constantly innovating and competing. Would you reflect on the nature of competition and maybe any findings you came across in the study?
Sure. I think we need to also recognize here competition is the means. One level, what you've touched on it, that innovation is really what drives economic growth. What drives productivity is newer, better ways of doing things. One of the best forcing functions for that innovation is a sense of competition, that if one doesn't improve, somebody else is going to be able to take your place. Somebody else is going to be able to serve customers better. So that is why we see competition as very important, because of the good it delivers, and because it in effect has a sort of a priori view that there's something else better out there. There are other ways of doing things. And when we've looked at the US economy and the economic openness that we see in the US, we see at the margins sort of concerns around competition that comes from degrees of lobbying, the amount of money in politics, not necessarily the stuff that's visible, but when you look around DC, Virginia, the number of companies that are putting large, not quite headquarters, but satellite offices, they're not there because there's an enormously good consumer market just there, but there's a political market. So when you hear of the likes of Google and Facebook and others who used to shun DC in the last few years, suddenly deciding it's worth their while having large offices, it's there to cozy up to government. It's there to do deals. Now, sometimes it's really important. I mean, as we've just been discussing, it's important for politicians to be really connected to the economy, to the business community, but that doesn't mean that you need to be having, large amounts of lobbying from, behind the scenes to create rules that may on the surface look really good for consumer protection, but are in effect, a barrier behind the scenes to prevent others competing. So that's where I would sort of, the greatest sort of watch out concern on the U.S. side is the degree of lobbying that's occurring and some money, the campaign finance, the extent to which large corporations are getting privileged access.
Preference, yeah.
Can I just add something? There's a really interesting thing happening in our society. There was a book written a few years ago about the education space, and it was called All Must Have Prizes. And it was basically a sense in which we're uncomfortable with our children competing with one another and there being a concept of a winner and a loser. Then in the ideas space, we're getting a culture whereby we are beginning to be uncomfortable about the competition of ideas. And if somebody says something that I feel uncomfortable with, then actually I want to either no platform them or slightly shut that down, or actually that's an uncomfortable experience. If this thinking takes hold in the next generation in the business world, we will lose the ability to have the competition of ideas and the competition in the business community. And that is a very unhealthy dynamic to see develop. The competition of ideas is what spurs us on to develop. It is what sharpens our ideas. It's what corrects us where we're wrong. We absolutely have to have that free exchange of ideas and learn to have the dialogue rather than say, I'm not listening. We need to actually allow one idea to win against another rather than say, I don't like you. That's an unhealthy dynamic that has been developing and which will stifle economic growth if we're not careful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Toby is one of our state's treasurers. He has been active in promoting trade, both on behalf of our interests here, but also just the role of small business in economic development. We're so grateful for your leadership. Do you have a question for the panel?
If I can only blush. I want to thank Jay for his great work and for his continued great insights since bringing Lagarde Institute here to Indiana.
Thank you, sir.
Your insights, your wisdom, and the nourishment of those inside wisdoms that dare to be disruptive, and I think it's caused a whole new.
Sorry, we're not picking you up.
Has caused a whole new vista for open dialogue and openness in Indianapolis, and those not busy. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
I'm Dr. Toby Malachi, founding executive chairman of Malachi Group Worldwide and global business diplomat. We've completed work in over 70 countries around the world. I personally traveled over 120 countries around the world. I have represented 4 White House administrations in an official capacity, 6 total. And I had the lovely honor to speak with the Baroness privately for a few moments, and Stephen, after my middle brother, baby brother, for a few moments, and really appreciate your being here in Indianapolis, the relationship through Jay since 2004 you've had here. So I'm going to be a bit of a disruptor here just for a little bit. I assume that's why we're here. You got two great people here. The world I live in is browning. It's not getting whiter, it's getting browning. And something that I think we need to do a better job at in Indianapolis and Indiana is having people more inclusive into these decision-making processes and these open economies and these panels and things like that we have here. So I thank you for that. I've had the honor to negotiate or be a part of an SME leader, small medium-sized leader, on 85% of our free trade agreements. I've been an open trader, a free trader. I'm proud of it. I say it publicly, and sometimes it's not well received. The Baroness had a great line here that opened up in your executive forward. Our mission at the Lagarde Institute is to create the pathways from poverty to prosperity to fostering open economies, inclusive societies, and empower people. That's very personal to me in ways that I don't have time to say here today, so thank you for that. I think one of the things we do at Malachi Group Worldwide is we try to match trade or business with purpose and poverty. I believe in giving the people who work for us, I believe in giving them an opportunity at fair opportunities with equal pay, equal opportunity to get good housing, food, provide for their families, and grow their families and bring them out of poverty. I am a person that came out of poverty. Broken home, to know my father, I can tell you, I can write a book on that. So to find more pathways to poverty and to share that poverty through your four pillars that you talk about. Trade is one that I definitely see as doing so. One thing in particular specific is my question is that I don't think, and the scripture says the poor will always be with the rich. You just can't get away from it. But I think social well-being and economic well-being have to be married. That the chain has to be connected. It has to be talked about more. It has to have some very difficult conversations, some uncomfortable conversations it's going to be for people. But if we don't do it now, then we're going to shut down, as you say, Baroness, competition. I served on OECD as a delegate for the White House. I served on TABD for several years, the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, European leaders versus U.S. leaders. And there seems to be in the air, and I'm sure Jay, who has got just an insurmountable amount of experience at this, a society where they want to close and keep things in as opposed to being more openness. Having young children in college, twin girls, 19 now, 20, I want to create a better future for them because I've raised all my 5 kids to be globally. Look globally, just don't look inwardly, but look outwardly. And competition is good, and don't be afraid of diversity. Diversity of thoughts are keen, I do believe. And you can't, I hear a lot about, well, the United States outsource. You can't outsource innovation, much as we try. And what I see here, you're one to open it up for all people, to come in. And I don't want to go on here, but it's just, I have such a passion for this. I just truly thank you for this. Professor, I want to get your book, Free Trade and Prosperity. Trade opens it up. I see trade is doing that. And just thank you, for that. But my specific question roundup is do you see SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, playing a larger role in open economies now, particularly in the frontier countries, developing countries, since the two powerhouses are fighting each other's throats, with India on the outskirts? But do you see more openness in the smaller economies now becoming more open?
That was a very welcome disruption, by the way. The theme of inclusivity, the nature of poverty fighting by economic growth, of course, I know you think deeply about the specific question about the role of SMEs is really intriguing. Philippa, would you like to start?
Thank you so much. And it was really interesting when we were talking as a team about how we wanted to describe the Institute and the pathway from poverty to prosperity, and you've picked up the fact that it's empowered people, inclusive societies and open economies. It was really important to us that inclusive societies was a key feature of what we are building. My own family is like the United Nations and is utterly kind of multi-ethnic, multicultural, and we win from that. We absolutely win from that and are stronger for it. And so thank you. And I have spent a lot of my time. We reference it very minutely in my words, creating pathways from poverty to prosperity for individuals, communities, and nations. And it's really important that this works for individuals and for families as well as at a national level, and that is all interconnected. In terms of your questions about SMEs, I touched on the fact that globally we need to create 500 million new jobs. We know that it is new companies, new enterprises, that those jobs will come from, that it'll come out of entrepreneurialism, that actually if you look at where jobs are created, it doesn't tend to be in established companies, it tends to be in the new, and therefore yes, it's going to come from the small and medium-sized, but actually we need those also to develop into larger companies too. So one of the comments in the UK report today is that we're pretty good at starting those small and medium-sized, but actually we don't have many that scale. You as a nation are so much better at getting those that really, really scale. So we've got things to learn from you as well.
Those are the great job creators, those small businesses, aren't they? And since we advertised Raju and concentrated on the emerging relationship with India, Raju, could I ask you to tell that story a little bit? We are drawing to the close, and so before we have some closing remarks from our guests, I would like this story on the record. Could you tell us a little bit, again, like with Larry, the origin story on how Infosys arrived in Indiana?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for a panel and also giving me this opportunity. When you said about the relationships, building the relationships around the world, and our Governor Holcomb says, take Indiana to the world, bring world to Indiana. At the same time, about India, he says, Governor Holcomb quote is, you cannot even spell Indiana without starting with India. So India is in Indiana. So that the relationships we build, it's not planned to bring a company like Infosys when we started building the relationships. We were not focusing on particular company, but we were building these relationships since 2010, as far as I know, between Indiana and India. I volunteered to do this, and then I was appointed as an Indianapolis, Hyderabad sister city committee when we built this relationship with Indianapolis and Hyderabad. Hyderabad is the name of the city in India, which is also called as a high-tech city. So that's where we started building the relationships. Today, we have Indianapolis, Hyderabad, sister city, Indiana, Karnataka, sister state, Pune and Columbus and Pune, sister city. As you heard yesterday news, Cummins is celebrating 100 years. They are in India for 60 years, last 60 years. So that's a great relationships that we built. So we look at as a trade between Indiana and India, two-way traffic. It's a bridge. They call me as a bridge builder. So I'm the bridge builder between Indiana and India. But we look at as a trade, two-way traffic, which goes from Indiana to India and India to Indiana. During these relationships building, we met Infosys executives in Hyderabad campus, even though they are not headquartered there. And we built those relationships with all the companies who met. And when they started expanding and looking at expansion in the United States, I personally invited them to host and come and see Indianapolis, they said, "Where is Indianapolis?" And today, the Indianapolis is the hub for them in the United States. They love it. When they came here, the governor, mayor, and the government, as you guys said, policies help quite a bit. I think we also talked about Indian policies in India, how Prime Minister Modi has created the environment to do easy to do the business. Same here. We all know that Indiana is one of the best state in the country to do the business. So that helped us to get these companies, and we have several companies from India doing business in Indiana. But of course, Infosys is the largest deal ever we made. And I'm also the founder and president of India Business Council, which I started as a volunteer, but today it became a full-time job. So I'm proud to be here. I've been here for 23 years. I love Indiana, and I also love India. So we have a great, unique, and genuine, real story that we share, India story. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well said. A couple of remarkable case studies, I think, that gives evidence to your research. Would you agree? Is that what you're hearing in Indiana?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Very good. Well, I do know that we advertised this time for adjournment. Philippa, would you like to offer any closing reflections on your time in the States? We were so grateful to have you here for the release of this landmark report. We know it's just a beginning. This investigation and the growth that needs to run on top of these very important ideas is emerging, and we're grateful to be your partner.
Well, first and foremost, Jay, can we just say a huge thank you to you, because this yeah.
Thank you.
You know, if things are done through trust and relationship, then we are here. Well, we first made the decision to come here because of you. But then as we looked at Indianapolis, we were just stunned at what an extraordinarily powerful case study it is of everything that this Global Index of Economic Openness is about. So we were absolutely delighted. And then when Larry, we met, and different ones of you we have met, it's just become a stronger and stronger story. And I just because obviously we're here just at the passing of Dick Lugar. Yesterday I was just reading all the tributes to him, and there was one which said, "He followed where his stubborn conviction and his considerable intellect led, regardless of political risk or reward." And I just think that's probably a good comment for us with this index, that we should follow where our conviction leads us, because we know that the principles in it, if we can harness them in different nations around the world, that it will lead to greater prosperity.
So well said. Thank you. I believe that we still have refreshments, so I hope that we'll be able to enjoy informal conversation. You're welcome to stay longer, but I'm very grateful for your participation this morning. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.